This morning, as we continue to ponder our theme, Love is the Widest Circle, we'll explore the life of Emma Eliza Bailey. When I've taught courses on preaching here, I've told people not to talk about in the sermon the writing of the sermon. Nobody wants to see scaffolding that was used to build a building after all, but after almost 20 years, I think of it now as jazz if I want to do it. As long as you're playing a weird note on purpose, it can still be called music. So I want to tell you a little bit about the writing of this sermon. I decided to preach about Emma Eliza Bailey because I wanted to know more about her. I knew that she was one of the first women ordained into Universalist ministry, not the first, but among the first. And I knew that she had done some work spreading Universalism up and down the East Coast, but also in what was then the Wild West, where I'm from, Indiana and Ohio and Pennsylvania. That was about all I knew about her. So I bought her book entitled, she had two titles and she never decided on one. So Happy Day or The Confessions of a Woman Minister. The book's available only because a group of scholars decided to print a few copies of it for its historical value. I got it and I excitedly dug in. I thought this would be one of those character sketch sermons in which I conclude by saying something like, "So let us all go forth and emulate Emma Eliza Bailey." Well, there's some of that. But like most of us, Bailey was too complicated to be painted as an unflawed hero. She was born in 1844 in what she describes as a stunningly beautiful part of Vermont. By her description, she was just the best kind of child. She says, "When I was a little girl, my father called me Bird because he said I seemed so joyous in all of my manifestations. I well remember how ecstatic I was, bounding and laughing everywhere, with the birds singing in my soul and flowers mirroring themselves in my spirit." One thinks of Julie Andrews. She tells stories of hiking with playmates through fields of green to the blueberry patches nearby, of trekking along the river to the mountain. Her father was a Universalist minister, and he worked to organize congregations, sometimes in really out-of-the-way locations. One Sunday morning, her father preached in a schoolhouse way out in the country, and I love this story. It's sort of a window into who was attracted to Universalism in the late 19th century. As soon as the meeting opened, the whole congregation, men, women, and children, everyone with the exception of my mother, began chewing spruce gum, with which they had liberally provided themselves as they passed through the woods on their way to the service. How mightily those jaws worked. Oh, the way that sermon was chewed down, the like of it had never been seen before. Father dare not glance at mother, nor she to look at the pulpit, for fear of laughter beyond control. Father said afterward, if that crude but kind people gathered there from all parts of the mountain digested his effort as well as they masticated it, an abundant harvest would be the result. Well, I'll get back to her idyllic childhood in a moment, or rather the one great interruption to her idyllic childhood. But first let me note that Bailey grew up to feel herself called to preach. It wasn't easy for a woman to answer that call back then. And to be called to be a Universalist preacher was a double hurdle for her. The Universalist who preached of a God who was so loving that there could be no eternal punishment were scorned by members of other faiths as heretics, back when that mattered. When it wasn't such a badge of honor as it is today, in my opinion. But even then, as a woman, and there was lots of prejudice about women in pulpits today and back then, and as a Universalist who was looked down on, Bailey had somewhat of an advantage. She loved denominational meetings when lots of people gather from around the region or around the country even to worship and connect with one another. So she wrote accounts of those meetings for Universalist publications. So when she decided that she was called to preach, she was given opportunities because people knew who she was from her writing. She was evidently a mighty preacher of Universalism. In her day, again, Universalism appealed largely to working class and poor folk. I love a couple of conversion stories that she tells in her book. One of them, an elderly man and woman come to her and tell her this story. They had a little cat that they loved a lot, and the woman who was telling her the story said, "We petted it a great deal. One day it fell into the cistern. She said, we had no ladder and could find no way of saving the poor creature. And so with tears rolling down our cheeks, we just had to stand by and watch it drown." She says, then her husband and she sat down to talk about universalism. How? If God had put it into our hearts to love animals as much as we did, how much greater must be God's love for God's children? And could God see any of them tortured forever and ever? And we said no, 1,000 times no. The heart sometimes arrives at universalism before the head. But even in this story, there's a simple and sweet sort of arithmetic at work. I love my pet with all my heart, and my love cannot be greater than the love of a God whom my tradition teaches me is love itself. I can't imagine torturing my pet in hell, therefore God would never torture any of God's children that way. They're coming to the conclusion that love must eventually win. There can be no world, there can be no universe in which love does not ultimately conquer. We speak of it differently today, but we still center our faith on that same all-encompassing love. One more conversion story from Eliza Bailey. She tells the story of a woman that she only calls Grandma Richmond. When she was young, Grandma Richmond's father would sit his children before a blazing fireplace and ask them to imagine, how long do you think you could hold your hands in that fire? He'd say, now, suppose someone was to hold your hand there for you and keep it there, and not only for a little time, but for all time and eternity too, and your whole body also, how would you feel? Well, that fire is nothing compared with God's fire in hell, and you will surely go there if you don't do right, and you will go there anyway if you're not elected to be saved. That brand of Calvinism was and is particularly terrible. It is soul-crushing. People live under its shadow and are affected by it all their lives. So a young Grandma Richmond, surely not then called Grandma, but I don't know what to call her, grew to wish that she had never been born, but also became very serious about pleasing God by being a good Christian. She married, and her husband, much to her horror, converted to Universalism. He was thrilled. He was so happy. He was singing around the house, thrilled to be out from under the burden of hell, but Grandma Richmond wasn't convinced. So she told Eliza Bailey, her minister eventually. Soon we went to a Methodist meeting, and my husband got up and said he loved everybody and loved everything. And she said the Methodist said, he'll come out all right because he has the love of God in his heart. He'll be okay. Give him time. Grandma Richmond says, I wasn't quite so sure of this, so I invited the Methodist minister to come with us home to convince my husband that the doctrine of endless misery was true. But she says, my plan failed. Then later, Brother Lewis, who was a Universalist, came again to our home, and one night after listening to his prayer and his clear, convincing talk upon the Scriptures, the full light broke in upon my mind, and I spoke out and said, I declare I do believe the love of God is universal. And then I shouted, I thank the Lord I've seen the truth. And my husband said, ain't you getting a little excited? This was the setting in which Eliza Bailey spent her entire ministry. She was helping people move from that soul-crushing religion in which people are constantly under threat to a message of love and inclusion, a God who really does love and will eventually reconcile all people. That was the message to which she dedicated her life. She served several congregations. She preached revivals in lots of other congregations. You know what a revival is? Maybe some. It's a sort of week-long meeting. There are preachers every night. For preachers, it's wonderful. For everybody else, I don't know. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people came to believe in love over hell because of Emma Eliza Bailey's preaching. It was a saving message, helping people come out from under the shadow of a vengeful God. And she overcame the jeers and skepticism of some men in her time about women in ministry, though she hardly even acknowledges that it bothered her. Maybe her tendency to joy really did carry her through a whole lot of struggle, or maybe she was worried somebody might read it and there would be repercussions. She was a remarkable missionary for the message of unconditional love. But there's one part of her story that haunts me, maybe because I see parts of my own story in it. I said she had an idyllic childhood, but that childhood was interrupted when she was about 9 years old. Her mother fell ill, and it was decided that the family would move to the south, to North Carolina, for a while to help in her recovery. There was a doctor there who could help, and the climate was thought to be curative. They were moving into slaveholding territory. So to get ready for the move, Emma's mother reads Uncle Tom's Cabin, though she had to sneak it because she was forbidden by her husband to read it because it upset her so. So the Baileys boarded a train and headed south, and there are so many stories of this little 9-year-old girl, what gets cemented in her mind, the things that she sees as she goes to the south. One of them, she wrote, "One circumstance made my mother, for the first time in her life, question the existence of a God. It was this. A noble-looking slave youth was seen in the early morning crawling to the cookhouse, dripping with blood, his flesh lacerated and his bones bruised and broken. The poor fellow had not heard the 4 o'clock whistle and so had overslept, bringing him 10 minutes late to his field work. The overseer had made this an excuse for giving the slave a cruel beating. Seeing him coming, he grabbed a rail from the fence and laid it over the young slave until he was crushed to the earth. He then left him alone in his awful condition to make his way to the nearest building as best he could, where he was sheltered for a time. Mother noticed a maiden lady of the house in tears, and on inquiring the cause, she replied, 'If you could only see what I've seen, you would not wonder at my tears.' And then she told her all about her poor Tom. Mother tried to comfort her, saying, 'This overseer is new, it may not always be this way,' but she refused to be comforted, saying, 'Blood is running somewhere all the time.' When the master, who was the boss of this vicious overseer and the owner of the house, when the master came in, he was in tears, and he burst forth with these words, 'I wish there was no such thing as slavery in the world.' The day wore on. Mother was thrown into a violent headache, and with her head bound up, she went out into the garden to pray. There she kneeled by the side of the lovely rose bushes and gave utterance to this expression, 'O God, if there be a God, this accursed thing of slavery must come to an end.' From her prayerful efforts, she derived some consolation, some healing balm, for a prophecy arose within her that the end must surely come, and to bring it, she must work with others. During that time in the South, Emma's father was invited to preach several times, and anti-slavery sermons that he had preached in the North, he took slavery out of them and preached the concepts. There are lots of stories about how they sort of coped with coming into contact with slavery, and then they moved north again. And there are some hints that her parents did follow through after they left the South. Bailey tells of her mother making her a black doll when she was there in the North. And she talks about her own childhood sympathies toward people of color. She's She committed herself as a young woman to, if she ever married, she was going to marry a black man, she said. But then, after the Emancipation Proclamation, she gave a speech in which she said, "I'm glad I didn't have to follow through on that promise because I don't think whites and blacks should mix." Sometime after they had moved back north, her brother enlisted to fight for the North, and her father went to see him in Baltimore. On that trip, he passed through Washington, and he saw 48,000, this is a quote from the book, he saw 48,000 colored soldiers under General Burnside pass through the streets for the war, and his heart burned within him to go with them and help achieve their liberty. Of course, he didn't. Emma Eliza Bailey seems to have believed that the emancipation of slaves solved the problem of race relations in America. It's impossible to judge her from here. I don't know what she may have done that I don't know about. But there is no hint in the book that she wrote about her life that she worked for racial justice after she came north. She became focused on personal holiness, the kind that led her to condemn pictures of herself and her sisters when they were little because they were wearing dresses with shoulders that were too low. She became a prohibitionist. Her mission was to save souls for God. An individualistic religion that's focused on purity, saving eternal souls, even if its central message is love, can allow a person to ignore justice work in favor of getting people right with God. Again, I don't want to judge Bailey 150 years later. She may have done much more than we know. But it sure looks like the fire for the cause of just treatment of all people seems to have faded for Emma. And if we're not careful, we religious liberals can still fall prey to that impulse. We might make the mistake of thinking that if we believe the right things about justice and love, if we say the right words, if we run in the right circles, that we've done the work. Let us never forget that our faith and worship services like this one are intended to fuel our spirits, to get us out into the world to act on behalf of love. Let us never think that our believing what we think are the right things can be a substitute for relationship and action and accountability. It is the definition of privilege to see a horror and to be able to return to your old life mostly unaffected. And it seems the Baileys largely did that, as frankly most of us do, to one degree or another, at one time or another. So, Emma Eliza Bailey was a complicated figure. In her story, we can be reminded of the deep need for the message of a love that pervades all the world, that undergirds everything that is. And we can hear the call to never let our comfort with that love, our confidence that we've been accepted into that love, cause us to forget its call to carry it to the most vulnerable. So let us, you and I, go out into the world carrying a great, fiery love to build a new way with all those we encounter. Amen.